Leading Britain's conversation. Speak to Sadiq. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, takes your calls.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning indeed to you. Quite a lot to get through today. If you'd like to ask the Mayor of London a question, any question, then the number you need, as ever, is 0345 60 60 973. And then later in the programme, we will wade into some of the stories that continue to dominate the news agenda. A degree of discomfort creeping in for me, in that the coronavirus crisis remains a matter of the utmost importance, genuinely a matter of life and death, and yet you know that some corners of this industry will probably be talking more about old episodes of Faulty Towers over the weekend or today than they will about the possibility of more death, chaos and carnage being inflicted upon us by, to be kind, relatively incompetent government. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning, James, and good morning to all your listeners as well.
We should, I imagine there'll be plenty of people asking further questions about potential protests this weekend. Just confirm precisely what your message is this morning with regard to potential meetings and protests in London this weekend.
Well, I support those who are keen to ensure that everyone understands that Black Lives Matter, but also I'm extremely worried about protests planned for this weekend in central London. And so I'm asking anybody who's thinking about protesting in central London not to do so and to find other ways to make your views heard. And I'm particularly concerned for 4 reasons. One is because it, frankly speaking, is almost impossible to keep your social distance with the numbers of people we've seen protesting over the last week or so. And we've had now confirmed cases around the world, from the US to Australia, where people on protests have caught the virus. But the other 3 reasons why I'm asking people not to come to central London to protest who care passionately about Black Lives Matter is because we know that the extreme far right are planning counter protests, and they're people who want to sow division and hatred. And what I don't want in central London is for there to be violence, vandalism or disorder. And the best thing that those of us who care passionately about Black Lives Matter can do is to stay at home and find other ways to protest about this really important issue.
How much sway do you think you hold? I mean, I don't know if you can answer this question honestly, but how likely do you really think it is that people will heed your warning?
Well, I'm imploring on them to. I appreciate that, it may not have cut through with some people who want to protest in any event, but I want you to ask yourself the question how you would feel if you returned home from the protest with the virus and gave it to an older relation. Ask yourself how you would feel if the extreme far right got all the attention because of the violence and vandalism and damage that could ensue and the disorder, which diverted attention away from the really important issue that you're campaigning about, which is to raise awareness of the racism, the discrimination and the inequality Black people still face in this country and around the world. And ask yourself, is it worth the risk this weekend? And so I'm asking, those who may have more influence than me to understand why I'm saying this. And people who know me, both when I was younger, but also when I've been a lawyer, a member of parliament and a mayor, will know that I'm not somebody who says these things lightly. I think protest is an integral part of living in a democracy, but actually we're in the midst of a global pandemic. And we now know the extreme far right will be having counter protests. And for those reasons, I'm asking people to please, please, please stay at home.
How do you categorise the extreme far right? Because it wouldn't be fair to use those words to describe somebody who is concerned about possible damage being done to a statue of, for example, Winston Churchill.
Well, we now know, not just the police, but anybody can do some basic research, that some of the extreme far right are using language of protecting statues, but really it's about them being there to, get involved in violence and disorder. And some of the language used over the last 24 hours by the extreme far right, you and I both know the characters we're talking about are one where they're talking about protecting statues, but they're also talking about taking on Black Lives Matter. And I'm really keen to avoid either, criminal damage, statues being damaged, graffiti, but also the violence and disorder. And my other point is this, our police officers work so hard. They work so hard. They're, under-resourced and overstretched. In the last couple of weeks, more than 60 have been injured. And I'm really keen also not to have them either taking a risk with their personal safety in terms of them being at the receiving end of violence, but also I don't want them to catch the virus either.
Let's go straight to the phones, actually, although, as ever, I reserve the right to come back with questions later in this phone-in. Let's go to Lynn, who's in Carshalton. Morning, Lynn.
Good morning. I've got a question for Mr. Khan.
Good.
While everyone supports the broad aims of Black Lives Matter, the protests have been undermined by violence. If it becomes violent this weekend, will you ask the police to take a firm hand with the violent protesters?
Lynn, thanks for your question. I think the vast majority of the protesters have been peaceful, lawful, and by and large safe. But I think you're right to remind all of us that a small minority have been involved in not just violence against our police, but also criminal damage of statues in Parliament Square. I don't understand the justification for burning the flag on the cenotaph or causing graffiti on the cenotaph. And I think it's really important that those small minority aren't allowed to detract from what this campaign's about. But I think this weekend there's a bigger issue, Lynn, which is not simply we don't have evidence from the US and Australia that people on protests have caught the virus, but also we're aware of the extreme far right plan to have what they call counter protests. And I think that's a potential recipe for violence, vandalism, disorder, and the spread of COVID-19. And that's why, Lynn, I'm asking those people who are thinking about protesting this weekend not to. And they can find other ways to have their voices heard. It's really important that with the best of intentions, protesters don't fall into a trap being laid by the extreme far right.
How do you prepare the policing for this? Because you simultaneously have to prepare for quite a high turnout while appealing to the public to not turn out at all.
Well, our police in London are experts in policing not just state visits and sporting events, but also protests. One of the challenges they have, though, is that the organisers have not been as forthcoming with the police. The police normally engage with organisers, they plan routes, they advise protesters how to keep safe. We're all aware of issues, in relation to controlling crowds. We all saw the horrific pictures around Hillsborough in '96. So the police give advice, and more often than not, organisers take the advice how to avoid narrow roads, where the best places to congregate. It's been difficult over the last couple of weeks for the police to get that sort of cooperation from the organisers because there are disparate groups organising this. So what the police are doing this weekend is learning the lessons of the previous 2 weeks, but also you'll have seen over the last 24 hours some of our statues in the cenotaph have been protected with boards. That's not new. It's happened in the past. We've protected statues in Parliament Square and elsewhere based on intelligence, but also using the principle of prevention being better than cure, but also making sure the police have support from leaders from across London, not just council leaders and myself, but others as well, to make sure we help the police where we can. And the best way to help the police this weekend is for those of us who feel strongly about Black Lives Matter to stay at home. Don't fall into the trap set by the extreme far right for there to be the violence, the vandalism and the disorder, which I fear may ensue if all sides turn up.
I'm going to push you once more on your deployment of the phrase extreme far right, because there will be a lot of people who would find the idea of some of these memorials, some of these statues being defaced or damaged profoundly upsetting, and they do not deserve by any stretch of the imagination to be described with the words that you're using. So just for clarity, what section of potential protesters coming to London tomorrow do you refer to when you say extreme far right? Because you can't be referring to anybody worried about a statue of a wartime prime minister being damaged.
Well, the likes of Yaxley Lennon and Batten and their followers and the so-called democratic football lads and on. But actually, if their concern is they're worried about Winston Churchill being, vandalised or the cenotaph having graffiti on it, well, we've now covered both those things up and the flags. And so I'm not quite clear what they'd be seeking to do, except to sow discord, disharmony, but also to try and provoke violence, vandalism and disorder. So if that was their reason for coming to Central London, that reason's now gone. And so that's
your argument is you have protected the potentially vulnerable memorials and statuary.
Well, if that was the basis of them having the counter protest. That basis has been taken away. What other reason can there be? And by the way, there are also potential people who can catch the virus and spread the virus. And again, similarly, I wouldn't want anybody to catch the virus or spread it. And so the 4 reasons why I'm asking people not to come to central London apply to the extreme far right, as well as those who are campaigning because, they believe, as I do, that Black Lives Matter.
Let's go on to Kieran, who's in Hampstead. Kieran, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Hello, Mr. Mayor. Just given the knowledge that the majority of average Londoners don't really care about the rhetoric of the far right or groups like BLM, my question is the Mayor's office's priority now shifted from preventing and reducing knife crime and youth gang-related crime in London to shifting monuments and statues that most people have never heard of?
Thanks, Kieran. Well, no, I think it's possible for a good leader to do more than one thing at a time. I can chew and walk. And so, of course, it's really important to suppress the violence. It's really important when I meet with the Commissioner, and I'm meeting with her again today, that we talk about a whole host of issues. One of those is how we suppress violent crime, not just violent crime against young people, domestic abuse, but concern about organised crime, organised by county lines. My other concern is finances of Transport for London and getting a good deal with the government. On Monday, we begin mandatory wearing of face coverings on public transport. I'm also concerned about what I've seen today with the 20% drop in our GDP in April. I'm lobbying the government for a fiscal stimulus. We've seen Germany have an emergency fiscal stimulus. I don't think we can wait till July, as the government's seeking to do. I'm also concerned to make sure those people who are in danger of losing their jobs don't lose their jobs. So I'm talking to employers. I've been in conversations over the last 7 days with the CBI, with London First, with the Federation of Small Businesses and other business leaders. We're still courting businesses from around the world to come to London. I've been in calls with those. So I think it's possible, Kieran, to do more than one thing at a time if you're a good leader. And I'll continue to do more than one thing at a time. But I think you would be the first person to criticise me if, God forbid, there were protests this weekend which led to violence, vandalism, criminal damage, and also the spread of COVID-19. I suspect you'd be ringing up next time I'm on, criticising me for not taking action.
What sort of personnel and resources are you putting in place for this commission that will review statues, monuments and street names across London?
Yeah, so I've got 2 good deputy mayors, one in charge of communities called Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard, and one in charge of culture called Justine Simons. They'll be opening up an advert for 15 independent members of the commission to advise on the issue of diversity in the public realm. And the sort of things that they'll be looking into is not simply the issue of, the fact there aren't many statues of Black Londoners across our city, but also the fact that the public realm doesn't really reflect a number of areas, not just gender. Millicent Fawcett was the first statue of a woman in Parliament Square. There's 11 blokes there, no woman. She was unveiled in 2018, but also people from the LGBTQ plus community, people who are disabled, Great Britons and others. And so they'll be doing that piece of work, but that won't stop Justine and Debbie continuing to do the other work they do in relation to communities and culture as well.
I think it was Tower Hamlets Council that took the decision to take down the statue of a slaver already this week. So where are the ones that you have dominion over, and which ones do local councils have the final say? Yeah,
that's taken by the Mayor of Tower Hamlets, Councillor John Biggs, who took down the statue of Milligan. And so actually, if you think about London, very little of London is the public spaces are controlled by the mayor. The most obvious examples are Trafalgar Square and Parliament Square. The vast majority are under the control of councils or universities or private institutions. So one of the things we want to do is begin the conversation with them. And so we're hoping that the 15 commissioners we have, they'll include council leaders, they'll include people who run art institutions and have expertise there, and they'll include those from the NHS as well. You'll have also heard the discussion in relation to Guy and Clayton in relation to hospitals. So that's the conversation that we've begun. And I think it's a really healthy thing. We shouldn't be afraid of conversation, or dare I say, education.
Had you heard of Edward Colston this time last week, speaking of education?
I had, but only if I'm honest, last year. There's a great historian called David Olusoga, and he did a speech last year. And that's when I first discovered Colston. I don't visit Bristol much, And so I didn't really know much about him. But friends I've got in Bristol, and friends of mine who are graduates of Bristol University know of him really well. So it's different for us Londoners to appreciate how big Colston is in the psyche of Bristolians in relation to halls named after him, statues, a statue of him and the rest. And so I think we can't really appreciate as Londoners the sort of impact he's got on people in Bristol.
And just to finally go back to Kieran's original question, will any resources that are currently deployed in crime matters, tackling knife crime or gang-related crime, any resources or personnel deployed in policing be redirected to your, I think this was the point of his question, to your statute commission?
Oh, no. No police officer will be involved in the Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm. But I'm afraid police officers that could be suppressing violent crime and taking action against violent crime this weekend may be diverted to police in the protest and counter process. Whenever there is a protest in London, often what the Commissioner and a top team have to do it's a necessity really, because of the shortage of police officers, withdraw officers from all the stuff they could be doing in their wards and other boroughs of London and pull them to central London. Similarly, sometimes the police have to pull the territorial support group, sometimes even the violent crime task force to help with police in protest and counter protest. And that's another reason, if you care about making sure that the under-resourced, overstretched police can deal with other issues, yet another reason why please avoid coming to central London this weekend if you possibly can.
20 minutes after 10, let's go to Winston, who's in Battersea. Winston, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Yes, I would like to ask the Mayor if he is going to be making sure that with that 20,000 new police recruits, if he's going to make sure that a very, very large majority of these recruits are black people. I strongly believe that we should have a hell of a lot more black people in the police force, and it doesn't matter what other black people may say, that if they look into Northern Ireland with the recruits over there, between the Catholics and the Protestants, they have a very large majority of these people within the force of itself. And
so it's a question about policing by consent, really. Is it? Are you going to be able to exercise any influence, Sadiq Khan, over the ethnic makeup of new recruits in the Met?
I am. Actually, Winston was making a wider point, James, with respect, yes. Which is actually the reason why it's important, but also the challenges black officers have. So first, some good news, Winston. We have in the Met Police today more black officers, more black Asian minority ethnic officers than not just ever before, but more than all the other forces put together. It's roughly speaking 15%, which is progress we've made. But actually, Winston, the heartbreaking news I want to give to you, and you, I think, were alluding to this, is our black officers face discrimination from members of the public, often black members of the public. And when I hear our black officers tell me that over the last 2 weeks, some of them have faced real abuse from protesters protesting on this important issue of Black Lives Matter, a small minority, I appreciate, it's deeply upsetting. And if you get a chance, Winston, the most senior black Asian minority ethnic officer in our country, Neil Basu, this week made a really brave statement, which I thought was, it was a really candid statement from him. He joined the Met Police Service in the weeks and months just before Stephen Lawrence was killed because of his race. And he talked about his experience and the challenges he faced. And you're right, Winston. I want to encourage, particularly black Asian minority ethnic Londoners to join the police service. I want them to, make a difference in their community. You'll have heard, Winston, the recruitment campaign we've got going. One of the things we've had to do, though, which is a bit of bad news last year, because we were keen to get new recruits in, we changed the rules we had, which is, basically speaking, only Londoners can apply, to speed up the pipeline of new recruits. We're going to hopefully go back to only Londoners apply. The reason why that's important, Winston, is because we know in London there is a large number of ethnic minorities, and it means that we can accelerate making our police service more reflective of London. And by the way, I want judges, I want the media, I want those on TV, I want politicians, I want the police, I want everyone in positions of power and influence to look more like our city.
What would you say to people listening to this programme and indeed following a lot of the news at the moment who are not BAME, who are, I suppose, like me, and they haven't fallen for the hatreds that you have referred to earlier, but they do find themselves wondering why so much focus and attention is being directed to other people when their own lives, particularly during this lockdown, their own lives are in a state of flux and potential disarray, whether you look at the economic figures or whether you look at potential employment problems and schools. What would you just say to white people who are wondering why so much energy and attention is currently being directed at people who aren't them?
Well, the 2 points I'd make is one of the reasons why I've got to be the mayor of this city is because of the support of many white people. I mean, the numbers of white people over the last 40 years of my life who have helped me, not just teachers, not just lecturers, not just mentors, not just fellow politicians and fellow lawyers, but I could go on and still do to this day, is phenomenal. I genuinely say that this is the best city for me to raise my children in, and I'm grateful for what this city's done for me. It's given me the helping hand. Many white people are giving me the helping hand. But the second point I'd say is, look, none of us have got life easy, but the experience of black people, not just in Minnesota, Minneapolis, not just in America, around our country and in London, is just different to the rest of us. And I include me speaking as a Muslim of Pakistani origin, Asian heritage. And I think one of the great things about our city is that we've got this huge power of empathy. And that means actually many of us, the white people you refer to, have taken the time to listen over the recent past in ways that we wish we'd done in the previous past, in the months and years gone by. And it must make us beg the question, why is it that a disproportionate number of black children are excluded from our schools? Why is it that so few black children do well in GCSEs and A-levels? Why is it?
The question moves into slightly different territory. I'm thinking more of people who are not sceptical, perhaps, but they're not as allied with the cause as the people you describe, and they're sitting at home listening to the radio now, and they're thinking, well, look, quite a lot's going wrong in my life at the moment. My existence is far from perfect. Why aren't you ever talking about helping me?
The point I was going to make is, if black people suffer less racism, less discrimination and less inequality, all of us benefit, not just black people, all of us benefit. And so, of course, I feel strongly about, the working class people who are white in east of London who are really struggling. One of the reasons why I was campaigning for the government to urgently address the issue of 0 hours contract and those in the gig economy was because it affects many Londoners, not just those who are black Londoners. One of the reasons why I was so keen to make sure that we are the helping hand in City Hall for the poorest Londoners, those from the poorest backgrounds, is because I appreciate it cuts across ethnicity and religion. You're right to remind me, as somebody in a position of power and influence, that it isn't just black people who have got it hard from COVID-19 and from the consequences of austerity over the last 10 years. But I still have a responsibility to point out that actually black Londoners do have it worse. It's just a fact. And I think you judge a society by how you treat its most vulnerable and those who are the most disenfranchised and disillusioned. And I'm really sorry to say this to you, James, but, it's black people.
Speaking of people of colour, we should probably add into the context of the statues being boarded up that statues of Mandela and Gandhi are also being boarded up today for fear that they would be defaced or damaged by a different section of potential crowds than statues of Winston Churchill or others. Thank you, Winston. From Winston to Winston. Thank you, Winston, for the original question. We're going to go now to Simon in Bedworth, although that's in Warwickshire, I think. I think you work in London, Simon. What's your question for the Mayor?
I do. Thank you for taking my call, Sadiq. I hope you're well. Right, it's regarding these dire figures that have come out, this 20% drop in GDP. These are dire under any circumstances. It's tragic. So what I'd ask you is, do you think there should be some sort of free trade agreement between London and the EU, if not the rest of the country, because of London's strategic importance to the economy? Something needs to be done. What do you think?
Presumably it's not possible, is it? I mean, I'd like to hear your answer, but I don't want anybody getting their hopes up.
Well, Simon, can I just ask you, James mentioned you work in London. What area do you work in? What's your field?
My field is electricity distribution.
Right. Okay, I mean, James, to answer your question, it may be possible in some sectors to work closely, business to business, not a trade deal. You're right. I unfortunately can't, nor would I want to, unilaterally declare independence and do my own trade deals with other cities around Europe or around the world. That's got to be done from Her Majesty's government. But we are lobbying the government in relation to some sectors, Simon. That's why I asked. So I was speaking recently with leaders of businesses in London, but also national businesses who've got offices around Europe and around the world. And some sectors are, I think, more worried than others. So the financial sector, it's really important that the non-tariff barriers are removed. And it's interesting, the announcement from the government over the last 24 hours by Michael Gove, that the sort of border checks, border controls they were talking about may not now happen, which really helps with the transfer of goods. It doesn't really help in relation to the transfer of services, except it may make it easier for people to move around. So I think that there are two things. One is the deadline for us to get an extension for the transition period is the end of June. And it's quite clear the government's not going to ask for an extension. So it really is important over the next few months that the government does a trade deal, a free trade deal with the European Union. And even more so because we now know from today's ONS figures that our GDP dropped by 20% in April. And some people in the government talk about a V recovery, a bounce back. I can't see how that happens if we've got the second part of the double whammy of us leaving on the 31st of December without any deal whatsoever. And so I'm hoping cooler heads prevail in the government, but also in the EU. We need cool, calm heads in the EU and the UK to reach a deal. The bad news is the government thinks the EU needs us more than we need them. But just looking at the numbers in relation to how much we export to the EU versus how much they export to us tells me that we need them more than they need us. And so I'm hoping that the government puts aside ideology and dogma and reaches a trade deal with the EU, because we now know from the USA that the idea that the USA can step in and do a deal with us that's equivalent to the benefits of the EU just aren't there. And just a final thing on this, Simon, which you'll know as a visitor to London, is I'm speaking to a number of our vice chancellors in our universities, and they are really, really worried about the intake this October as a consequence of both COVID-19 but also Brexit. When you bear in mind, London has the largest number of foreign students of any city in the world, but also we've got domestic students deciding to defer a year. I'm really worried about the impact on higher education, which is so important to the offer London has to businesses around the world.
I think we'll move on to another question now. Before we do, what if you would put numbers on it? What do you think the likelihood is of them coming to some sort of trade agreement, however flimsy and however much remains to be concerned? What do you think the likelihood is of signatures actually being put to paper before the end of the year?
I'm confident that we'll do a deal. I think the government's, even this government's not pig-headed. I mean, the idea that Johnson, Sunak, Raab and Gove would go into next year still recovering from COVID-19, or still potentially in the midst of COVID-19, maybe in a second wave, without a deal with the EU, would be the worst form of self-harm that this country's ever seen. And so, I think they realise the importance of this. We're talking about...
Even if it means them pivoting from no deal is better than a bad deal to any deal is better than no deal.
They've got no choice for the simple reason. We're talking about levels of massive unemployment we've not seen since the 1980s. And you will know from some of your listeners that employers have now started to consult their staff on redundancies because they've been told by their government they've got to pay 20% of their wages and they can't afford to do so. And so I think the government's got to, be pragmatic, which is, I know an oxymoron when it comes to this government, be pragmatic and realise actually that a deal with EU, although they may get a few days of bad press from their friends in the media, it's worth that short-term pain for us to recover from the consequences of COVID-19.
Speaking of this government, are you engaged in constant contact with regard to coronavirus and the continuing catastrophe in that context? Are you attending COBRA meetings still? Because I know you were a bit aggrieved not to be invited to it. Pardon?
And it's really important I say this in a calm way, but I find out what the government's doing by watching their press conferences on a daily basis. I've not had contact with the Prime Minister for weeks now.
How many weeks?
At the last COBRA. So whenever the last COBRA was, I think 3-4 weeks ago, when he announced the roadmap. That was the last time I attended a COBRA. We discovered, because of my conversations with the First Ministers in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, he does meet with them. And I'll make this point in a courteous way. We, London, have a population of around 10 million. Scotland has 5 million, Wales 3 million, Northern Ireland about 1 point something million. All three of those are smaller than London, yet we aren't around the table. We aren't being engaged and consulted by the Prime Minister or the Chancellor. And it does cause me huge concern when you bear in mind on Monday, we now will have mandatory wearing of face covering, something I was talking about weeks ago. And I think this is just about better engagement, and just engage with us, work with us, because actually we've talked about the health impacts of COVID-19. But one of your early callers, Simon, was talking about the economic consequences of COVID-19. And the government's got to realise London is crucial in relation to both health and the economy of our country. That's why I'm really keen to work with them to make sure we can get through the transition and then a recovery phase going forward. I think the last time I spoke to Boris Johnson was the 10th of May. And so that gives you an idea of how little engagement, the Mayor of the capital city is having with the Prime Minister.
It's the 12th of June today, and you haven't had contact with the Prime Minister since the 10th of May. It's unlikely that he holds your office in low regard because, of course, he held it himself for 2 terms. So why do you think that the Mayor is so, how do we put this, uninterested in you?
Well, it's a question you've got to put to the Prime Minister. I've been writing to him.
You must have given it some thought. What theories have you come up with?
Well, there are some members of his government we engage with. I spoke to Robert Jenrick, the MHCLG Secretary of State, last week. But it's a question you asked for Boris Johnson. I simply couldn't answer that.
We won't detain you for much longer, but we will find time for James in Southgate. James, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Khan.
Good morning, James.
You're a very intelligent man, I know that. Why, and also that Black Lives Matter, the organisation, is a far, far left organisation. And you must have known, and I knew, and everyone knew that understands these things, there was going to be trouble. You knew that. Why did you not say
just to clarify, James, if you just allow me to clarify, of the thousands and thousands of people that were protesting in support of Black Lives Matter as a movement, a tiny proportion of them would be in any way allied with the Black Lives Matter organisation to which you refer. And I know you're a very intelligent man, and I know that you know this, but just for the clarification of anybody who may be confused.
I appreciate that. But that small minority are the ones that cause the problem, and there will always be that. And especially this time of COVID-19. And you never actually came and actually criticised the fact that these people that were called thugs, or they called thuggery, you criticised the Prime Minister for saying that word instead of coming on before that and saying it wasn't until Thursday, 5 days later, after everything had happened, that you actually started coming out on Twitter and everywhere else saying these people are going to be brought to account. Why did you have to wait so long?
Okay, let me respond to the various points that you've raised. So firstly, in advance of last weekend, I was quite clear in relation to my advice to protesters that they shouldn't protest, and if they were going to protest and not listen to me, then it's really important they try and keep their social distance of keeping 2 meters apart, to regularly during the course of the day use the hand sanitizer and to wear face coverings, but it's really important they do so. I was also quite clear about criticising criminal damage done in our city in relation to what we saw with Winston Churchill, and with Cenotaph and with the flags.
Did it take you until Thursday to do that? Did it take you until Thursday?
No, it didn't. I mean, the gentleman from Southgate can look at my social media account in advance of last weekend, and he would have seen what I was saying in relation to this. The point I make in relation to the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary leading with thuggery or reckless or criminality is it shows a lack of empathy and emotional intelligence about why more than 160,000 people wanted to protest and raise the point that Black lives matter. And it's the racism, inequality and discrimination that Black people face, not just in Minnesota, Minneapolis, USA, but around this country and in London as well. And indeed, the point I'm making in response to you is with respect, it took our Prime Minister 5 days to actually make that point in the video message he recorded with his unkempt hair. And the question I put back to you as a supporter of Boris Johnson is, why did it take Boris Johnson 5 days to acknowledge Black Lives Matter?
Well, James may not be a supporter of Boris Johnson. He may consider that libellous. James, I have to invite you back at this point.
He assumes a lot, doesn't he?
Is it true?
May I ask you, pardon?
Is it true?
It is true.
Oh, okay. My apologies.
But I don't. When somebody votes for somebody, we never know the outcome anyway.
So just to go back to the Mayor's address, your points that the chronologies were wrong on that. So I think you're saying, why didn't you make more robust statements before the last lot of protests, similar to the statements that he's making now? Is that right?
The other point, James, is I'd like to know why he finds it so important now to employ 15 people to go around looking, and plus all the other people that don't like statues, or they're just trying to cause trouble, to take down, I think it's nearly 100 statues they found now, including Captain Cook, and somebody was even mentioned on the radio about taking down Nelson off of Nelson's column. The other thing, now we have a rolling time bomb, if you like, not a rolling time bomb, but it's a time bomb, which now we're getting banned. Gone with the Wind, a famous film, is being banned.
It's not being banned. It's been temporary.
Yeah,
I hate to be rude. But a lot of the things you just said aren't true. The Captain Cook statue that you refer to, where is that?
Which one?
You're talking about the Captain Cook statue on the Mall, on the Mall, are you? Near Admiralty.
They want it moved.
Near Admiralty Arch.
It moved. It was from. It's from Plymouth, I believe. It's somewhere on the coast.
No, there's one in London as well. This is kind of the point, isn't it? There's such inflammatory words, and yet when we look at the detail, I mean, have you got any plans to remove a statue of Captain Cook, Mayor Khan?
No.
Okay, and how much will the 15 members of the commission be paid?
I'm not sure. Normally we get volunteers to work on our commission and stuff. So if the question is worried about lots of money being spent on this work, it won't be. But the important point I'd say with respect is this: look, the society we live in now is very different to the one 300 years ago. I'm not sure if it was ever appropriate to have statues of slavers. But also I think it's important for us to have an opportunity to look at not just our statues, but our squares, our streets, blue plaques, to see whether they adequately reflect the contribution made to our city. And so I make the small point. A week after I became mayor, I was approached by somebody called Caroline Credo Perez. And she told me that there are 11 statues in Parliament Square. All 11 are blokes, not one woman. And so she began a campaign to have a statue of a woman in Parliament Square. We now have Millicent Fawcett. Now, that's just one example of many of us who love this city, have been here all our life, just not realising there are so few statues of women. And so, you've gone to removing statues, and some statues should be removed. I welcome Tower Hamlets removing Milligan. I welcome Guy's and St Thomas removing Guy and moving Clayton. But actually, this is a bigger discussion about having our city's public realm, public spaces better reflect the contribution made by many, many different people, different backgrounds, not just ethnicity, but the LGBTQ plus community, those who are disabled, those who are women.
Apart from when you're answering questions on the issue from people like James in Southgate and me, how much of your sort of working time do you foresee dedicating to the issue of statues in the coming months and perhaps years, depending on the next election, of course?
Well, no, fortunately, I've got two deputy mayors who are doing this piece of work for me, in addition to the other stuff they do. That's one of the things that the joys of having deputy mayors. And so actually, except when I'm answering the question from the caller from Southgate and the previous caller, I hope not too much of my time's going to be focused on this, because the key focus of Black Lives Matter isn't about statues. Actually, it's about addressing the structural racism, about addressing the inequality that Black people face, from education to health to criminal justice system to mortality. Those are the chunky issues that the movement wants me to focus on. And sure, there's an issue of public realm, which obviously will be dealt with, but we mustn't lose sight of the bigger picture here.
Does that reassure you, James?
Not really. No, we're in the biggest. This pandemic is really.
But he's just said that he's not going to be dedicating any time at all to this particular issue, except when he's talking to people like you and me.
He has an army of people doing it for him now. He's set the ball rolling. He started the ball rolling.
Sadiq Khan, do you have an army of people dealing with this ball that you've set rolling?
No, I don't. And I think, to be fair, James, I'm grateful that you rang up, James, to ask me these questions. But let's be honest, you're not going to be persuaded of anything I say, and so I understand that and I respect that. But just to reassure you, James,
you could do even less in the issue of statutory. That would be encouraging, perhaps.
But just to reassure James, the ringer inner, that actually we are focused at City Hall to make sure we can address the issues caused by the crisis in relation to transport, in relation to the economy, in relation to the issue of a second wave of COVID-19. And actually, one of the reasons why I've been challenging the government on a whole host of issues for the last 13 weeks is because actually I think had the government taken a different approach, we would have had fewer deaths and also less, catastrophe caused to the economy, illustrated by the 20% dip in GDP in April. So I'll continue to lobby the government because I think the government's got to come up with a really important fiscal stimulus urgently to address what could be COVID-19 moving to us going towards a recession and then a depression. And I'm also keen to avoid those who previously suffered disproportionately from recessions, in other words, Black, Asian, minority ethnic, suffering worse this time as well.
I'm going to squeeze in hopefully one or two calls on slightly different subjects. Let's go to Paul, who's in Finsbury Park. Paul, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Hi there. So since March, children have had a really hard time being under lockdown. It's coming up to summer. Usually there'd be London's adventure playgrounds, of which there's about 80 of them, will be getting ready to set up summer play schemes. London Play has written to Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, to ask for guidance on how these really valuable, always situated in the poorest parts of London, resources can be opened. Is there anything the Mayor can do to push this forward so that children that haven't had the place to play and socialise with their mates can have a brilliant summer?
It's a poignant sight, isn't it? Seeing all the tape and all the blockage put up on these playgrounds.
Look, we are speaking to London Council. James, would you mind getting the gentleman's caller's details, and I'll let him know what we're doing. But also, what I'll do is, I know Battersea Adventure Playground and Wandsworth near me, which I used a lot when I was younger. They are a lifeline for children who haven't got a garden in particular. I'll speak to the caller offline, and we will let him know what we're doing. But also, we can actually speak to the councils who are keen to reopen them. And actually, I think this is just something the government's overlooked because they've been preoccupied with other stuff. I'm sure we can open them sooner rather than later. And the good news is the science is quite clear. On average, the science says you're about 19 to 22 times less likely to catch the virus outdoors than indoors. And with a combination of good cleaning and good supervision, I'm sure we can reopen them, for the summer holidays. And so we'll take the caller's details down and make sure we liaise with him about how we make some progress here.
Stay on the line, Paul, and Ava will take care of that. If you don't hear from the Mayor's office, let us know, won't you? Michelle is in Shoreditch with the final question, I think, today. Michelle, what would you like to ask the Mayor? Oh, and it was all going so well. Michelle, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Hello,
Hi,
Michelle.
Hello, hi. I live within the congestion zone, and I've lived here for the past 11 years, and I have a parking permit for a small car that I occasionally use, if at all. I've never applied for the congestion zone resident discount because I only use the car at weekends, if at all. I heard on the radio that the congestion charge was going to be extended to 7 days a week until late at night, and upon hearing this, I registered for the congestion charge discount on the 20th of May, uploading all my documents and paying £10 charge. I've received a letter saying the residence discount has been temporarily suspended on the 18th of May, and therefore my application has been rejected. My car is now a hostage. I can't afford to pay £15 to move it out of the zone and £15 to move it back in the zone. I live here and I'm a high-risk cancer patient, and whilst I walk as much as possible, I occasionally really need the car because I want to avoid public transport if possible, but I occasionally need the car, and I think I have a right to use my car, but I can't.
Just to reassure you, there's obviously you've got so you are entitled to the exemption. James, again, sorry to give more work for Ava. Can you give me the caller's details? I'll follow it up personally, but you are eligible for the exemption that you referred to. I'm not sure why you've been told you aren't. Again, James.
So who has seen it suspended since the 18th of May? Just to be clear, do you know?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because basically we're extending the application period for the discount scheme, and so if I could take the caller's details, I will follow that up. But also, I'll make sure I find out why she was given the information she was, and just to reassure Michelle. We'll speak to you today, but don't worry, James does chiv me if I don't respond to his callers, and so I promise to chase that up.
I do, Michelle, so do make sure that you keep us in the loop on that as well, just in case it slips through the cracks. That's it for another Speak to Sadiq session. Come Monday morning, Sadiq Khan, what would you consider to have been a good weekend?
A number of things. Firstly, I hope that no people come to Central London to protest, not just the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the extreme far right. I'd hope on Monday morning that anybody who wants to use public transport is wearing a face covering, which is the law by Monday. But I hope most people, if they can work from home, continue to do so.
Sadiq Khan, many thanks indeed.
Stay safe.